Okay, so now that we've talked a little bit about combining different kinds of harmony at the same time, now let's talk about combining different kinds of harmony successively, but in the same piece, okay? I call this eclectic harmony. In other words, using more than one kind of harmony within a given phrase or section or movement, okay? Different kinds of harmony being used one after the other. One point it's important to specify here. This kind of harmony should not be confused with mixing styles. In good eclectic harmony, when it's well done, it feels unified. It doesn't feel like you're just jumping around from one style to another. And in fact, if the composer is a real composer, the composer will have a face, okay? And that face, that the character of the composer should be apparent at all times, and it acts a kind of a unifying feature. Okay, so obviously it's possible to use different harmonic techniques in sharply articulated sections or movements. But for that, you don't need much teaching. You just do one movement in fourths and one movement in thirds or whatever. Or you can do them much closer proximity. However, we know that there's a basic principle of form which says that most transitions should be gradual. Too many sudden transitions would be rather like a novel where every single chapter starts off and then something strange happened. Once or twice it's okay, but by the time it's happening for the fifth time, it just sounds like the author doesn't know what they're doing. So because of that, most of the time, and the situation that's going to interest us here is combining different kinds of harmony, but smoothly joined together. Okay, we need gradual transitions if you want, which require the equivalent of modulation, let's say within tonal music. And we're smoothly moving from one to the other. Transition in general is a larger musical problem, and in fact in composition it doesn't apply only to harmony, it applies to a lot of other things, but harmony is what we're going to talk about here. Transition is always based on finding common elements between where you start from and where you're going, emphasizing the common elements, and creating a sort of coherent thread that the ear can follow while moving between the two. You can arrive at these transitional elements in different ways. One way, you can add something. For example, you could take triads and add, let's say, added notes. And with added notes, that could get you to the point where you have harmony that will eventually lead you, let's say, to polyharmony. So by adding things to simple harmony, we could get to polyharmony. We'll get more examples later. You could also proceed by subtracting things. You can start with a polychord or a cluster and take away notes until you leave only the new kind of harmony that you're aiming for. Another possibility is creating dissonances that resolve to the new kind of harmony that we're aiming for, something which makes you feel a need for the new notes in the new chord. Another way, again, is rhythmically lengthening or accentuating the melodic elements in the previous chord, which begin to suggest a new sound. Again, we'll see all this in operation in the example. It's really important when doing a transition to think about timing, the way the new sound arrives. And at this point, we're mostly interested in having it arrive gradually. In other words, the characteristic intervals of the new kind of harmony should emerge gradually and gain importance. The voice leading absolutely must be smooth. That's the single most important aspect of creating smooth harmonic transitions, is the voice leading, keeping it fairly conjunct, common tones where possible. The other principle of a good transition of the timing is don't change other dimensions of the music at the same time. If you're making a harmonic change, that's not the time to change the register or the orchestration simultaneously. That'll give you a bumpier transition, and that's really not what we're aiming for. Just to be clear, sometimes in an actual piece you might want to do that, but here we're talking about within one fairly short piece using different kinds of harmony, so it's important that the transitions be pretty smooth. The piece we're going to be looking at, in fact, is not long enough to contain really huge contrasts of that sort in more than just the harmony. So, okay, what I'm going to do now is I'm going to go through the different kinds of harmony we've talked about in the course up till now. I'm going to take each one and talk about what it can be transition to, where you can go from that kind of harmony, and just say a word or two about each one of these transitions. I'm going to start off with modes, because that was the first subject we discussed in the course. So, modes can easily lead you into tertian harmony if the modes supply chords in thirds. If the mode itself, or if the modes or mode has third-based chords, it's easy to get into third-based harmony. Added notes, same thing. Mode's going to added note chords. If the mode contains the added note, then there's no big problem there. Modes can go to polyharmony, but that's trickier because if that's going to happen, all the notes of the polychord would have to be in one mode, which usually doesn't happen. So that tends to be pretty complicated if you're trying to get there from modes. If you want to go from modes to intervallic harmony, basically the only limitation is if the mode gives the required interval in sufficient quantity. If I want to go from, let's say, Dorian mode into harmony and fourths, well, in Dorian mode I have D, G, E, A, F, B, etc. I have a bunch of fourths, so that shouldn't be too hard. So it really depends on the mode and the interval you're aiming for. Modes going to sets is usually too limiting. The sets are usually too intervallically unusual to stick comfortably into a mode. And also modes going into serial harmony usually doesn't work unless you use a series of less than 12 notes, not too many transpositions, and at least a reasonable number of the notes in the series could be mapped onto the mode. Okay, now let's talk about places we could go, transitions we could make from tertian harmony. So tertian harmony, you can go to added notes very easily. What's the link? Well, using inversions of seventh chords right away gives you arrangements with seconds in them, and that sounds an awful lot like added notes. So that's an easy one. Harmony by thirds going to polyharmony, again, pretty easy because sevenths, ninths, etc., especially if they're chromatic, can easily sound like polyharmony. So that's an easy one also. Harmony by thirds going to intervallic harmony, usually the way to do it is with inversions and non-harmonic tones. If you want to go from a triad into harmony by fourths, once we invert a triad, we get already a fourth in the top voice. Top, let's say, CEG becomes EGC, there's a fourth. If I have an added note to there, that adds another one, and then I have a fourth and a fifth. So that's not particularly difficult, or the added note could be used as a passing tone. Same thing. Tertian to sets in series, only if thirds are very prominent in the set or the series. Usually doesn't work very well. If we start from added notes really go easily to polyharmony because you just take the seconds and add more of them and change the register, and then you have polyharmony. Added notes to intervallic harmony, also pretty easy because you can use added notes to create whatever the desired interval is, and that usually gives you a nice bridge to get there. Added notes to sets, really only useful if the cell or the set contains the seconds that you would have in the added notes. That becomes the bridge. Adding those to serial generally doesn't work because of the too great variety of harmony in the serial harmony. If we start from polychords can go to intervallic harmony pretty easily, again, because they contain generally right away a lot of notes. So working by subtraction, usually it's pretty easy to get into intervallic harmony. Polychords, by the way, can also go easily into mirror harmony because mirror harmonies generally are just a certain kind of polychord. So those are two kinds of harmony that fit really well together. Polychords and sets in serial harmony, usually the chords and sets in serial harmony are already too complex to move them easily back and forth with polychords and keep it coherent. If we start from intervallic harmony, we can easily move from one kind of intervallic harmony to another, usually by inversions. Once you invert any kind of harmony, it introduces other intervals, so it's pretty easy to get fourth harmony to start including seconds or thirds with inversions. Like if you pile up 4 fourths, we have a third in the outer parts, for example. Okay, so that generally is not much of a problem. Notice that when you're mixing fourth chords and tertian sounds, you have to create a fourth sound in a tertian context as a transitional sound. Usually that's the best way to do that is as a passing note, a neighbor note, an appoggiatura, or whatever. Seventh chords are also useful since a seventh can be broken up either as a pile of thirds or as a pile of fourths. So that easily becomes a common element. And all you have to do if you're heading for quartal harmony, starting from tertian harmony, is just rhythmically start to emphasize the fourths more and more. So whereas they might have been passing notes at the beginning, eventually you start having them on the beat. Okay. Intervallic harmony to sets only works if the set uses the interval in question quite prominently. Intervallic harmony to serial harmony generally doesn't work unless the series is very limited in the kind of intervals it uses, because usually serial harmony has great variety of intervals which doesn't fit well with intervallic. Finally, if we start from set harmony, pitch class sets, it can go to serial harmony if the cell is derived from a subset of the series. If the cell exists in the series, usually it can be done. Okay. all these transitions, I've given them in the order of A to B, but they all work just as well in the other direction. I said sets to series, but series to sets is the same problem. I talked about polychords to intervallic, but I could go intervallic to polychords. It's exactly the same problem. So that's why I haven't bothered to list them all in both directions. You note that I have not mentioned linear harmony in this list. The reason for that is linear harmony is always based on some other kind of harmony as a norm, whether it's thirds or fourths or whatever, and it's simply voice leading that gives you other possibilities. So in general, that kind of harmony, the basic kind of harmony, whatever it may be, is going to be the starting point, and the linear harmony itself is a kind of elaboration. So the linear harmony is sort of a category apart.